I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and this is The Radical Center, a recording project I began in 2022 as a way to describe and discuss the social and ideological currents that are rapidly altering our culture. In a time when political polarization seems to be the norm, I'm seeking to understand rather than react. I'm grateful to all the thoughtful men and women who share their stories and insights with me in this conversation series. If you would like to contribute to this project financially, there are links in the description. Thank you, and thank you all for listening and being part of this exploration. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Douglas Novotny. And so Doug Novotny, you're a practicing clinical psychologist with 25 years clinical experience and 14 years teaching and supervising therapist. You completed an interdisciplinary psychology PhD at the University of Chicago and an internship at Harvard's Cambridge Hospital. And you recently founded Your Positive Sum LLC to offer constructive solutions to culture war problems that undermine psychology, education, and more generally corrode the values and civil society institutions upon which the Western model of freedom and human flourishing is built. And that sounds really interesting. So I am very much looking forward to this conversation and learning more about your background and how you came to be doing the work that you're doing right now. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Leslie. It's great to be here. Really admire what you've done through the years I've been following you, and it's a pleasure to talk. So let's figure out how we can get into stuff.
Oh, thank you so much. So what drew you to psychology in the first place?
Yeah, well, I was, first of all, let me say this, actually, I should distinguish, a bit of a disclaimer,
Okay.
that as you introduced me, I am a clinician, but this conversation, a lot of the work I do is not clinical, right? And I like to distinguish that. I've gone to the point of actually forming two corporations to clarify that distinction, so that while I'm doing clinical work, I'm doing something different than the conversation we have here.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I call the realm of ideas, right? Where I'm willing to and eager to go into things in great interest, but not be speaking about specific people and not be giving advice as a clinician. If my experience there means that what I have to say is somehow valuable to clinicians or to a clinical realm, great. But it is a kind of a distinction which is important to me. So I wanted to mention that. But then you ask, how did I get involved in this? I get interested in this stuff, right? So, University of Chicago is an important place for culture. And that was my great interest. I actually had started business school and thought about trying to make a bunch of money being at a top business school. But academia drew me. I was super interested in how people understand themselves in a culture, in a system of meaning that they often don't fully understand. And so I thought I'd be a professor and do that. But I quickly figured out that academia wasn't very appealing for various reasons, which probably don't matter that much here. And I was able to parlay the psychology, or what it was the Department of Human Development, which is a kind of a cross-cultural department. I was able to parlay that into a clinical experience and eventually a license. So that worked for me as a very practical way of still doing this. Mm-hmm. But it was this deep curiosity really about what makes people tick, how do people think about things? And of course, this was back in the 90s. So how could I know, right, that this would have become the hottest button issue ever these decades later? It just grew and grew into more of that. And so I felt for a long time that I had been trained in how to think about this, and I had some ideas that were important, and that somehow there was a total disconnect between what I was taught about culture and the way psychology as a field was talking about it. And these two worlds weren't communicating. It just seemed like a golden opportunity to try to add something. So eventually I'd been dipping my toes in that and now diving in more.
That's really interesting. Can you say a little bit more about that divide? Like, how were those two things different, the way that you were taught about culture and the way psychology was addressing it or speaking about it?
Sure. Well, you might know University of Chicago is real big on cultural anthropology. And it's so big that it kind of took over the university. There's a lot of courses of the cultural aspects of this, the cultural aspects of that. And that was certainly true for my training. I was taught, I like to say, as much as an anthropologist as a psychologist. And so a great deal of our coursework and talk on the side and among, friends was, what is it like to go to another place on earth and imbue yourself in that culture and then understand psychological functioning? For instance, are emotions the same in another country,
Oh,
even though you might translate those words into a word that we understand in English. Does it really make sense when family structure and the concept of the person and what's sacred and profane and how people get married and die and have children, all that stuff that's rich anthropology is so different? Does it make sense then to talk about individual psychological functioning in the same way? Do the theories even make sense? So this is what we're doing, and trying to take it very seriously the assumptions that an anthropologist makes when they go and they live in a village or they just live in a foreign city and they bring all their cultural assumptions with them, how to question them. So that's what I think of, and that's what I mean when I'm talking about culture. But then in psychology, the contrast could hardly be more stark, because it seemed to me that what psychology was talking about when it talked about culture was basically identity politics, right? Race, multiculturalism, but not with the sense of a coherent culture to start with, just this idea that people are different and they clash in groups. And assumptions weren't being questioned. Categories just seemed obvious to people, and you were expected to adopt what they thought was obvious, which is the opposite of good anthropology. To me, it's the opposite of good psychology, actually. But that's the kind of thing that was so grating to me. And people were just using these words over and over again. And I just thought, we're not speaking the same language.
Yeah.
But it felt nearly impossible to engage that conversation because of what we know about cancel culture and the way people address these things. So many of those presumptions are, the premises, I think of them as, are set in stone. And to question them even, let alone to disagree, right, is to make you a bigot or somehow stupid. And so, again, that just seemed like such an opposite experience of what I was taught. And yet I found it very difficult to engage.
When you talk about the psychology perspective of culture being more like identity politics, that really resonates for me, because it's kind of there's a requirement that we all think about things the same way.
Right.
But then we're supposed to pay this special respect to these really superficial aspects of self and treat them as if they're, we're supposed to know what weight is afforded to each different category. But then we think about them all in an identical fashion or else. And so I wonder, when did you start to notice that? Was it that way even when you were in graduate school, or did this sort of creep into your awareness over time? Was it like the 2015 peak for you, like a lot of people, or just curious what your observation was?
That's a great question, because people often ask this, right? When did it start? And for many people, I mean, this is something we could come back to. This is a clinical application of this kind of stuff, I think, is to think about for oneself. When did you notice? Or when did you develop the courage to say something? Right. I'm talking about my lack of courage for a long time, or my lack of a capacity somehow to engage it. So, I'm not proud of that all entirely, but it's a mixed bag. So when did I notice? Yes, I would say it was very much, the groundwork was being laid when I was in graduate school. I'm sure before then. I mean, now that I've studied it, I think it was decades earlier, but certainly when I was in grad school, the ground was being laid in most areas of academia. And my little corner at U of C was different. I felt that we were really being taught how to take this super seriously as anthropologists. We were even taught to, think about a person's dreams while doing field work in another country, and that those dreams would somehow be important as like a counter-transference window into understanding the cultural divide. That's how seriously it was taken as a process and a psychological endeavor that was also culturally imbued. But to answer your question better, I think, yes, it was certainly happening then. Then we might have called it political correctness from the 80s. In psychology, I think it was not very thoughtful, but I wasn't as close to psychology at the time, and the politics were different. But I would say that so many of the assumptions were there, and it was just slowly unfolding, slowly getting worse. And I kept thinking, this has to turn. No way, this makes no sense. I know this is wrong. The contradictions will become obvious. Like you mentioned one of those contradictions, right? There's so many, but crazy making to say, what was your comment, that you're told that you have to be aware of differences, but that's being done in a sameness way. have to agree with this. You have to think the same as everyone
Hmm.
about differences. It breaks your brain.
Yeah, it does. It definitely does. So you had this sense that this is also absurd, it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. It's not going to last. This is going to
Yeah.
crack, and saner heads will prevail.
Right. This is one of the many ways I was wrong. Right. I mean, I thought this can't last. Yeah. That
Mhm.
Santa had to prevail. And I was less involved. I mean, I was trying to do grad work and I was, not paying attention to clinical psychology as closely. I was doing trainings, but I wasn't as involved. So perhaps I wasn't as aware of it. But I think that's right.
Mhm.
I thought this had to break. This was a fever that couldn't go on. And it's just been proven wrong over and over and over again. All it does is accelerate the nonsense.
Mhm.
See?
Mhm.
And so, that just, that's a problem. But yes, I definitely felt that I saw some of this early. And even at Chicago, even in my department, there were hints of it. For instance, I was interested in men's issues, and um, one of the professors there was also interested in masculinity as a cultural
Mhm.
component,
Mhm.
how different that could be. But he thought that in the American context, well, I don't know everything he thought about it. We didn't go into great depth, but it seemed to me pretty clear that he thought that the men's movement was mostly worthy of mockery.
Okay. Okay.
And that's just an example of where, the assumptions are already baked in.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I don't need to be, a proponent of a men's movement per se, but I certainly think it's interesting and it's revealing something important.
Mhm.
Um, and that kind of curiosity applied to other cultures was not being applied to ours as well as it should be. So
That's
yeah,
so interesting.
I hope I've answered your question. I think it was the groundwork was laid in a big way, but it
Okay.
was much quieter.
Yeah. Well, you spoke about like a long period of your own career where you didn't have the words to describe this or didn't feel like you had the capacity to formulate a challenge or something. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm curious about what was going on for you during that time and what changed.
Yeah. Well, I know it happened in stages for me. I'm not sure how much my life part of it is worthwhile for everybody, but to answer your question, let's say this. Maybe there's a few key moments in time, I could illustrate. And one of them was coming out of my graduate program and then, psychology internship is an intense year where people, I'm working 70 hours a week and getting tons of hours of supervision and really thinking about what it means to be a practicing clinician. And soon I'll get my license and all that stuff. Um, but along the way, and I was at Cambridge Hospital that was taking, was under the training tutelage of people who thought a lot about culture too, and actually, I think, in fairly intelligent ways. But so I was developing it on the side a little bit, and I actually got trained as a diversity trainer of all things.
Oh, wow.
Which now, I look back and I think, oh, like mostly when people say, "Oh, I'm a diversity training," I think, "Oh God,
Yeah.
stay away from me."
Yeah.
But I wanted to do it well. And I
Hmm.
thought it could be done well. I thought it was very important to do. So I
Hmm.
got trained in it. And
Hmm.
I actually did a training on my internship and thought this might be a career for me.
Hmm.
Um, but I quit. So it's an example, I hope, of answer to your question as to how did it begin to rise. I was like, when I looked at other people who are doing diversity training and I talked to some of them, and I thought, oh, maybe you'd give me an entry level job, or maybe I'd learn how you're doing it.
Hmm.
Realized, the way I would put it is these people were not interested in diversity.
Okay.
They were interested in something else, which I now understand better, right? Which is something like, well, I don't know if we want to go down that road too much, but like, talk about things in the proper way, right? You need to engage identity politics in a work setting, say,
Yeah.
using the right words and all the right narratives.
So it's
And
about
that
control, not diversity.
that's nicely put. Yeah, and I sensed that. And so I just backed away. I just said,
Okay.
"Oh, I'll take a different course. I'll just be a clinician. I can do that. And someday, maybe I'll be able to do this." And then so that was one big clue to me. And that would have been 1999.
Mhm.
So after most of a decade of training and this stuff, I thought, hey, I can really put it to work. And maybe I'll even make money doing this. And I don't know, it sounded really just so exciting. And I thought, oh, okay, dead end, cul-de-sac, turn around. And I just went this other way. And so then later when I was in organizations that were doing clinical work, again, this kind of stuff was brought up a lot, but with even less thoughtfulness. It was all about, think of identity politics stuff. Do kind of political action with your families. I was doing a lot of young child work, and all those assumptions seemed to me pretty baked in. And so I could push at the margins. I could think about things. For example, in supervision, I once said, I remember very well saying, people are without resources, but I think the most important resources are internal ones.
Mm-hmm.
That you don't have to have external resources necessarily to have a rich psychological life, to be a good parent, to be quite satisfied even. And I get it, poverty is horrible, right, in various ways. And there's all kind of other things that we really want to pay attention to, right? But I see a lot of very unhappy rich people.
Mm-hmm.
I see a lot of satisfied and admirable poor people. And I'm working with folks to be better parents, children to grow up. And I want to pay attention to that psychological aspect. And oh boy, people were not interested in that conversation. Just another example. And so I learned to not bring it up very much, at the margin I could. And then when I got around to actually training therapists, so now I'm training, graduate students, people and postdocs in doing supervision, teaching classes. Again, it just became very clear that people were being taught what seemed to me a rote conception of what it meant to be open-minded and interested in difference, and have brave conversations. I kept thinking, this conversation isn't nearly brave enough. But you're talking to the room as if, people like me, because I'm this straight white guy or whatever I am, that I was the one who was afraid of a brave conversation. And I was just itching for a braver one. So these were ways that the clues became clearer and clearer, coming forward to what you bring up, maybe 2015, right? Well, in 2016, when there's an election going on and people got even more activated and they felt even more self-righteous about their point of view rather than curious about other ones. And that's when, things went extra nuts. But I didn't feel that was new. I just felt it was worse.
So more out on the surface, more overt.
More on the surface, more overt, more people who are willing to say those things, which seem to me very closed-minded and narrow, controlling, as you say, or who otherwise might have been quiet about it, and now felt either they could or they should, very often they should, right, say something. And just a shutting down. I think when people get self-righteous, right, they feel less of a need to question their own assumptions and listen to other people. That just seemed to be, I would call it an excuse. People like to feel good about themselves and think they're the moral actor. And so when you have this horrible person to hate, it's very convenient. And people act on it. That's what seemed to me has happened for the last 9 years.
There's so many things in what you're saying that are really, really interesting to me. One thing might be the sort of confused tolerance. That state of, I'm not really sure how to respond to that, and it seems really ridiculous, so it's probably going to burn itself out, so maybe I just don't do anything and just and I feel like I think about something like, here's a totally separate issue, but the homeless problem in Seattle.
Yeah.
So it starts out, I don't know what year, but I moved to Seattle in 2009, and there were people panhandling and there were homeless people, but you're like, I don't know, you really want to interfere with somebody else's life, and you kind of have sympathy for people, and so and now here we are, what, 15, 16 years later, and it's so bad. It's just tents everywhere and just danger. The streets are dangerous and people are moving out like crazy. And I know I'm using that as an example just because it's something kind of concrete and less conceptual.
Okay, right.
But it seems to relate. There seems to be an analogy there to some of the other sort of ideological concepts that you maybe tolerate this kind of speech around diversity because it sounds stupid. And I don't really know if I'm the one to formulate a counter to this. It's not really being addressed at me. It's kind of being addressed generally, but surely enough of us think like I do that this is going nowhere. And then here we go a little bit further with down the line, and there's so many people
Mhm.
thinking like this or pushing this into policy.
Yes. Oh, I think you're onto something so important is that it's not just right. So what? This ideology, if we think of it, I like to think of it as a set of ideas, as an
Hmm.
ideology. And one of the really important things about it, which is that it has a structure.
Hmm.
Okay, it's not just an idea in isolation. It's a set of ideas and a certain way of approaching ideas themselves, not even the specific idea. And so I know I get a little conceptual, don't I? But you want to make it practical too, that's fine. And actually, it's like a high wire act. I don't know if you'll be my net, but I feel like I always want to go into the definitions and the subtleties of what words mean, words like culture. But
Hmm.
then I promise
I love
that
that. I love it. I love etymology. So I'm like, just
I'll
break it down.
I promise that I'll try to bring it back to make it very practical, and including clinical, because this
Hmm.
has clinical ramifications all over the place.
Hmm.
That's why I think we're in this enormously productive moment. I think we have an opportunity to take this and run. It's like so much of this is oppositional, right? We're trying to stop wokeism or whatever we call it, or say, hey, no, that doesn't make sense. And I want to say, no, no, we have to do way better than that. We have to actually build something and take this and go. And I think we have an opportunity. So, so let's link it to what you're saying. So, right, you're in a dinner party or
Hmm.
just listening to the news, or you're just driving down the street and you see all these homeless people and you're thinking to yourself, this is horrible for them. It's
Hmm.
horrible for me. I
Hmm.
can't, my children go on the street there and the businesses are affected and all the rest. Enormous sums of money are being spent and all this stuff. And it doesn't seem like it's getting better. I think it's getting worse.
Hmm.
But you almost can't say that because why? Because it would be, it's only viewed as compassionate to support the homeless. And supporting the homeless means what? Usually give money or support some nonprofit that's working with the homeless. And it's failing to understand, what Abigail Schreier talks about in therapy, the iatrogenesis, the harm you can do by trying to help people. And so this is something I've been trying to talk about for about 10 years with students, is that a lot of support is unsupportive. And if you're a good clinician, you have to be really trying to consider that risk and how to avoid it and how to do better, how to notice it when it happens. So that's just the beginning. But the idea is that, right, you see it pop up in all these different topics and they appear to be different. I call it the mole run structure. It's like you can whack a mole over here.
Hmm.
Oh, homelessness, we have to work on it. And it pops up over there in psychotherapy or in, voting law or in what else? Education, CRT, right? How to raise children, trans, what it means for the elderly, everything. And it, in many ways, it appears to be a whole group of different topics, but in another way, it's one.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's the same kind of be a good person, don't think, and don't contradict what appears to be supportive. Just for instance, I mean, there's so many examples, but that's one. Yeah. And then, so I think the other way that we can start, we'll bring this back later or now if you want, but it's like this way that it breaks your brain, I said. And you said you were feeling, forget your words of a couple of minutes ago, but it was something about this idea that you didn't know how to understand it.
Hmm.
And you didn't know what to say, especially.
Hmm.
Um, this is a profoundly clinical experience, right? Especially if you're working with uh, characterological problems with people, but really anyone has this experience at times, and it's a countertransference experience that you better get good at if you're going to be a really good clinician, is
Hmm.
noticing when you feel this, when you feel this doesn't make sense, or can't say what I'm thinking. It seems so obvious to me, but I'd better bite my tongue. Now that's an important clue, right? And so it can be really fun to explore, but when it's not fun at all, when you feel like there's a sledgehammer hanging over your head.
Hmm. So you're saying listen to that inner feeling because it's giving you information about the situational dynamics and the other individual or the other party.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yes, exactly. So it's like it's a meta level. It's an interpretation of countertransference. And
Hmm.
so if you take it for the homeless issue, I'm not sure if we can make that link, but we probably can.
Hmm.
Somehow, uh, right, I want to help the homeless too.
Hmm.
I want to begin by not calling them homeless. because I don't, Michael Schellenberger does a lot of good work on this, right? I don't think that the main problem they have is a lack of a home. And so even if I refer to them as homeless, this is where the language wars become so important. I'm buying into a narrative that I don't agree with and I don't think is helpful to people. And I'm doing this with a loving heart. I thought about it a lot. I think I'm no expert exactly. I don't necessarily want to be in charge of it, but I have ideas. I have ideas about how to help this situation. But if I start to say things like that, back to the internal resources conversation versus external, the external in this case is a home, a house. If we just give them housing, I don't think we're solving the problem. We might be worsening it. But I can't say that. If I don't care about these people somehow, I'm told. And so I have to know how solidly I feel confident in my own goodness that, for all my flaws, right? I do actually believe this. I actually think this would help them more if we didn't call them homeless. But I dare not say that among many colleagues.
It kind of ties into what you said about support being unsupportive.
Yeah.
And the actually giving external support can be a way of sort of cutting off an individual's ability to access their own inner resources in that important way that you're talking about.
Yes, that's nicely put, right? So that it may actually distract them from the job they need to do.
Right. Which I know that tends to sound uncompassionate in the modern paradigm that we've laid out, where we are all kind of responsible for each other, which is in a way that's really beautiful. That's really good. But there's a way in which it seems like we've gotten addicted to these measurables. And you can measure things like dollars and homes and smart treatment planning and things like that, but you can't measure someone's inner experience.
That's true. Right. So part of this may be a measurable thing. People talk about, the testing that came into No Child Left Behind and kind of trying to do education based on tests, and then people teach to the test. Maybe that's a problem. But I would say it slightly differently because, yeah, I mean, you're right, for sure. I agree with that. But I would add that the measurable, which most people focus on in these conversations, is how much did we do to help or support? How much money did we spend? Right. Not, did we actually decrease homelessness? Are people better off? That would be a measure I'd be interested in.
And how would you measure that?
Whew. I don't know. I mean, homelessness might be easy just to see how many people are on the street. Being better off in general, that's a tough one, right? Even psychotherapy research, outcome research is very weak as a whole, as a rule. So it's hard to measure these things. I'm not sure that I can really answer that very well, but or even in an individual treatment, right? How's it going? Okay. Well, you have to ask, right? Or be interested in the question, first of all, rather than presuming you know what it looks like, that answer. That's the kind of curiosity that I think makes for a good anthropologist, a good psychologist. So it's like maybe an answer, is it? Or am I dodging? To say that I want to ask the question and be genuinely curious about it.
Something that I don't know if this is where you were taking this or what you were thinking, but as we're talking, one of the things that I'm kind of hearing and also I've been thinking about a lot is the way that the kind of compassion culture, support cultures, welfare culture, if you will, whatever you want to think of it as, it fundamentally underestimates and devalues people by saying that they require that in order to live. And so we set up the system where everybody's thinking for everybody else. And so it's kind of rotten from the inside, because where does the seat of flourishing live if it's always unagentic and sort of externalized? I don't know if I'm putting that together very well, but I wonder what your thoughts are.
Oh, I think so. Right. So you're talking about mind reading.
Sure.
In part, right? And this is something that Jonathan Haidt, who, by the way, see, he trained where I trained at Chicago.
Okay.
I'm very much in his vein, sort of thinking about moral psychology. And we were trained by the same guy in terms of how to think about culture.
Okay.
So we could go into moral foundations theory possibly today, or I don't know,
Sure.
whenever,
I'd love
because
to.
that would partly answer this question, is that right, going to his and Greg Lukianoff's book, they talk about how counter-therapeutic much of this ideology is.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that you'd be treating people as victim, and if you own, I mean, people are victimized, right? We have to
Mm-hmm.
say it. But the fact that you would only think of them as a victim undermines them. And
Mm-hmm.
the idea that you could mind read a person's motives,
Mm-hmm.
this is contrary to good psychology. It's certainly contrary to good group process,
Mm-hmm.
and it fuels intergroup warfare,
Mm-hmm.
right? All the things they're supposedly out to help. So here's iatrogenesis on a structural scale, no
Mm-hmm.
matter the topic we're talking about. So I think that's what you're saying. That
Yeah.
if I know what you're thinking and why, I'm doing no one a favor.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, we always do this. We infer and assume and project, and we say, oh, you're actually up to no good, right? But at least if it's a conversation, you might learn. And this whole thing is about shutting down conversation,
Mm-hmm.
in my view. Yeah, I think I've answered your question. It's terrible for people to have that assumed about them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in, you mentioned moral foundations theory.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where to begin, right? Let's just do the 60-second synopsis of it.
Okay.
Maybe the idea is that um, that there's that great YouTube that Jonathan Haidt does, millions of views on how Republicans and Democrats think differently. I don't know if
Oh,
you're familiar
I
with that
haven't
one.
seen it. Okay.
It's from like 2004, again, to talk
Okay.
about how old this problem is.
Yeah.
And he was so the idea is there are, it depends how you count, but maybe there are 5 types of morals. And he found cross-culturally, there are, this holds up if you ask people, and there are things like, well, so what's really interesting in this conversation is that, and he focuses on this, is not just me, in his book, his excellent book, The Righteous Mind, the liberal people, however you define that, think of left-leaning American liberals, tend to focus on the first 2 morals, care and fairness.
Okay.
And you can imagine how we hear this all the time, right? I think this kind of makes common sense to a person, that this is what you hear about talked about often. So care and fairness, and that's fine, right? Nothing wrong with it, but these are the 2 that liberals tend to focus on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then what's really interesting is that the other 3, see if I can come up with them right off the bat, which include things like in-group, out-group loyalty as a virtue,
Okay.
hierarchy, which is to have leaders, to believe that some things are better than others, there's up and down, and then sanctity versus impurity. These are the other 3 moral foundations which exist cross-culturally, including here, but liberals tend to discount those. They exist, but they're not focused upon very much, whereas conservatives tend to focus on all 5.
Mm.
And
That's
this makes
interesting.
and yes, it's super interesting. And he called it the conservative advantage. He being
Okay.
a liberal, he calls himself a centrist now, but he, having been a liberal supporting John Kerry back in 2004, when he was thinking and writing about this originally, he's like, how can we help liberals? Because they're missing these 3 moral foundations, which would make them much more effective, at least electorally.
Hmm.
But I'm thinking,
It seems like
wait,
they've done that. They've
psychology.
just
Oh,
I mean,
yeah,
they've definitely got the in-group, out-group loyalty. I mean, for instance, when I was in graduate school, my faculty advisor told me, we know we're no longer training counselors who can work with the Trump supporter. So
right.
there's in-group, out-group. If you're a Republican, we don't even pathologize you. We see you as something that's outside of the scope of our ability to work with you because you are so tainted. So
Yes.
that's a definite out group. If you're not one of us, you're not even human. And then the
Right.
hierarchy, I suppose they've taken over a lot of the positions of power. And
Hmm.
then sanctity, I would say they've got their purity spirals that they do. But so
For
I wonder
sure.
if they've taken his advice and that's what
Well,
to what they owe
I
their
only wish
success.
I only wish they would have taken his advice,
Okay.
because I think that he's a genuine guy trying to solve problems.
Hmm.
And I think that he's calling upon people on the left side of the spectrum to listen to this problem and to realize it. But I think you're right that they're using it. But this is something I think is super important. And again, psychologically, I think they are using those three moral foundations, but they disavow them.
Okay.
So and because they continue to focus upon the first two, they frame their purity spiral in terms of care and fairness.
That's true.
That's why, yeah. And they claim that the Trump supporter, as you put it, right, or told to you, I'm sorry to hear. I've heard that too, of course, that sort of thing. They frame Trump himself or anybody who's MAGA or really anybody, a lot of liberals who simply divert slightly from the plan, right? They frame anybody like that as horrible. But why? Because you are xenophobic, because you are tribal, because you hate others.
Yeah, it's a reversal.
It's a reversal, but it's even worse than reversal because it's a disavowed aspect of themselves. See, they are doing the othering. They are doing the othering while holding up this giant placard that says, you are othering. It's a projection.
Yeah, they absolutely are.
Through disavowal. And that's on all those three other moral foundations, in my view.
Okay.
Yes, they're highly interested in purity spirals, but they claim there's no such thing, right? You should not have any shame, right? There should be no body shaming. You do whatever you want sexually, all the rest, right? And that's they tend not to be religious. I know we're speaking somewhat in stereotypes, but these things hold up, at least if you could say descriptively across groups. Again, we're not talking about any one individual, right? It happens with individuals, including me, but we're not now talking about not pointing a finger at anyone, but these groups do happen.
Right.
With when we're talking hierarchy, yes. The ideology of wokeism is interested in one thing primarily, power. It says power is the only thing that happens, or the only thing that really matters, right, in history. But they'll say, you're the one who's grabbing and holding on to power. So, and hierarchy is challenged most of all, I don't know how much more detail to go into, but I think that this is the problem, is that for those who are unaware of their own moral structure and the things they're using, it comes out toxic. See, if I have aggression in me, even I don't think aggression is all bad, right? I don't mean it in that way, but even hostility, I can hate sometimes. I try not to, but I have a feeling that passes, and being aware of that, I think allows me to contain it. But if I say, no, I don't hate anybody, I just love, I think you should become suspicious of me.
Well, right, because then you're still hating something. You just don't classify it as someone anymore. So it becomes a much darker thing, a much more dangerous thing.
I think that because I believe that we all have these darker aspects to ourselves, if I'm saying I don't, and it's extremely important to me that I don't, and that you agree that I don't, bad things are going to happen in our relationship. And so this is a clinical matter again, right? So back to moral foundations and the left-right split, right? That's one thing that I think is happening in a big way in these conversations, and if we could get better about talking about things in terms of morals, but not saying who's moral and immoral, having a conversation about how they function and how they motivate behavior, we'd be so much better off. That would be true diversity.
Yeah, you've given me so much to think about. Thank you so much for those sort of little side trips into the definitions of things. I really appreciate that. So, kind of thinking back to your timeline.
Yeah.
So you're noticing these things, you're seeing these currents around you, even back when you were a student, sort of coming up through the 2000s and on. Can you kind of talk about what you noticed in the field or in the culture and how your thinking about it evolved as time went on?
Sure. I suppose I'm not sure. Let's talk about the field and culture, but perhaps if I could defer that, and I think the
Yeah.
better answer is the last thing you asked,
Okay.
is that how my thinking developed on it.
Yes.
Um, Not because my thinking has to matter that much, but because I think it's back to this topic we were discussing of how do you notice,
Mm-hmm.
or how does one notice, right?
Mm-hmm.
How
Mm-hmm.
did I notice when I had a thought that I couldn't say, or how did my thinking develop? Because this is vital. Is that what I began to figure out was that I wasn't thinking well,
Mm-hmm.
partly because I knew I had good ideas, right? I had
Mm-hmm.
thought well about these topics in the past when it was at Chicago and thinking of myself as a student, but applying it to psychology, especially clinical psychology, was difficult. And I thought it shouldn't be difficult. I know how to do this, right? So what's wrong with me? And I realized that a part of what was wrong with me was that I couldn't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
So this again comes back to how clinically relevant this is. This is like, I've been traumatized. Let's say I was abused and
Mm-hmm.
I can't talk about it. And so it's going to fester.
Mm-hmm.
But if I can talk about it with a trusted individual who cares about me, then good things happen.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's what we believe in talk therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not talking about trauma for myself, although I felt pretty bad sometimes. But what I mean is that my thinking was poor
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't have fellowship. I didn't have people I could talk about it. I was censoring myself. And this is very bad. Now, Jordan Peterson talks about this is bad for your soul. You're going to
Mm-hmm.
pay a price if you
Mm-hmm.
speak, but you might pay a higher price if you don't. I was paying that price. So I began to notice it and I began to teach it just a little at the edges,
Mm-hmm.
developed a whole, lesson on this. And I have kind of in various forms of development, many hours of these lessons with PowerPoints and all that and jokes. I'll give you an example or two and pictures and trying to make sense of this. Um, and try to actually engage on it in an intellectual way and apply it to the work. And when I began to do that, it got better, but I was still rudimentary. And it was only later when I could actually talk with people and find people like you who are willing to bring it out and join groups like OTI and um, that really helped a lot more. So yeah, what's my point? My point is that two heads are better than one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. And I was learning that age-old lesson. And in fact, I developed it into my model, this LLC that I don't even really have a website yet. There will be, one soon, but called Positive Sum, the idea that people can be in beneficial conflict
Mm-hmm.
and together can make something more than either of them can make alone. This is what I had to do. So maybe that's a little bit too roundabout of an answer, but
No, I think it's a great answer. It reminds me of my favorite therapy meme or cartoon.
yes.
It's a person, I think it's two women sitting together. One of them is the client and she's sitting there and she's got a speech bubble and it's this big tangle of strings just tangled up. And
Yeah.
then the other one is the counselor and she's sitting there and she has a speech bubble above her head and that one of the threads goes from that tangle into a nicely wound ball of yarn. And it's sort of the way that through dialogue with someone who really cares to engage with you, you
Mhm.
can sort out the confused thinking and the conflicts in your own mind. And I love that drawing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Hmm.
Uh, Right. And so I would say that's great. I would say it only slightly differently, that it seems to me that
Hmm.
the organization of the jumbled yarn
Hmm.
happens between the two people.
Mm.
That if it's too much in the therapist, then the therapist is
Oh,
a kind of a sense of superiority that
right.
may be true in certain ways, but we would reach for something in the between space.
Yeah, I like that even better because it's true that a lot of times the therapist is just working off of guesses and just reflecting back. And it's through those reflections and where they get it wrong and where they get it right that the client
Right.
then listens and says, "Oh, no, but here it is."
Right.
And so you're right. That's an improvement even.
Yeah. I mean, Winnicott talks about play space, right? The idea, it
Hmm.
almost equates it with therapy, the idea that you can be playful with ideas, feelings, and with another person. When you can do that, then you're creating something. Not just, yeah, creating is the key word, right? It's creative, it's playful, it's new, and it's somewhat unpredictable. And so that's what makes it lively, I think, when it's done well. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good meme, though. It's funny. I mean, humor is important. I think that's one of the things that's great about the humor, right? So, example, okay, I can take one of the jokes. I'm not that funny, but I appreciate humor, and so I don't want to pretend I can be entertaining. But the joke means something here, and I think it fits with your idea about the moral foundations theory and whether, say, people on the left or liberals have these other three, and in the way they do. But one of the jokes I like to use comes from something I heard on the radio many years ago. This is my way of introducing the concept of ethnocentrism. Okay. Right? The idea that a person just assumes that the way they view the world is the way the world is, and that other people must see it, right? And so there on the radio, I actually heard this, I don't know where, that there was a debate at the time about English being the official language in this country. And so somebody says, if English was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. Right? And so she's reading the Bible in English, right? I guess, and assumes she's spoke English, which, I consider a kind of a form of ethnocentrism is kind of ignorant and just wrong. Okay?
Yeah.
But people who fancy themselves educated and smart and better than these rubes love that joke. Right? Because it fits their prejudice of people who are uneducated or somehow ignorant. They're the egocentric ones.
Right. Oh.
But then they don't like it so well when they notice or are told that they are narrow with only 2 of the 5 moral foundations, which is a different kind of ethnocentrism.
That's really interesting.
Extremely resistant to that observation.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And so I call it like true diversity. And I say, are we going to have a conversation that's truly diverse? Are we going to truly support homeless people? Are we going to, that's where the language gets important.
When you were talking about the poor thinking that comes as a result of the confusion and the contradictions that are being presented, the sort of response that you're having to someone or something that is crazy making or full of inherent contradiction. I was thinking about, this is something that I have spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about, is the impact on counselor trainees of modern counseling education. And I am really concerned about this. I don't know if I had not gone back to school in 2019 and my last engagement with higher education had been, it had been 2010. I'd been in law school, and prior to that in undergrad. So I'd been exposed to graduate type professional program and undergrad about 10 years prior. And then coming back when I did, it was almost unrecognizable, the kinds of ways that we were being talked to, the things we were being asked to believe. If I had not done what I did then, I don't know if I would have thought it was hyperbolic if people were describing what I'm describing in my program. And I would have thought, oh, this is a person who's describing some real things, but she's exaggerating them. No, it's really concerning. And one of the things that I'm concerned about a number of things. One is that there are a lot of counselors who are being trained who just believe their training and maybe go on to practice the way that they're being taught to practice. And then there's another subset of people who self-select out. Like I saw people doing, good people in this program dropping out, throughout as it progressed. People who said, I can't do this. This is crazy. I'm out. And then there's that other set that stay in, either speak up or don't speak up, but end up carrying that feeling that you're describing, that poor thinking, that disorganized processing of what their experience. You called it trauma, and I would agree with that. And so now you've got all of these different groups coming through this and taking place in our culture as the therapists and counselors that serve people, even
Right.
the ones who are, I suppose, uh, trying to not be ideologically captured and trying to mount an intellectual resistance to some of the stuff that they're being taught. They're not coming out intact. They're coming out a mess. They're hurt by this. I mean, they're really hurt. And I, speaking from experience and speaking from all the people that I've spoken with who've been in these programs, and
Right.
I worry about this. I think that right now I don't, people say, what would you advise a person who wants to become a counselor?
Mhm.
And people, often the advice is from counselors, just get through it, keep your head down, do the work. When you come out, you can practice the way you want to. You don't have to really pay attention to that stuff.
Mhm.
And I'm not able to give that advice because I think these programs are incredibly toxic right
Yeah.
now. And I don't know what that means going forward, but I wanted to relate that because that's relevant to the process you're describing.
I think so. Right. I feel for you in this. And it was horrible for you, and it's horrible for many people.
Hmm.
Question would be for somebody like me who, either of us, trying to advise a younger person or
Hmm.
anybody younger, not just trying to, like, what do you
Right.
do?
Yeah.
And it feels like, here again, see, it's where you brought up the homelessness example, and I'm
Hmm.
saying it's a structural thing, so it
Hmm.
applies everywhere.
Hmm.
Would you go into psychotherapy training? I have a hard time recommending that.
Hmm.
Would you would you go into higher education at all?
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
call it lower miseducation.
Yeah.
Okay, and people who have children
Yeah.
looking at that like I do, it's
Yeah.
hard to know what to advise. You need to do something, and you need to build yourself, but how and where? Wow. And it's like, I feel like the institute, this is we call institutional capture, right?
Hmm.
We're developing in our last decade especially, I think we've been developing a language and a structure of understanding this that helps. And so it doesn't solve all the problems, but it helps to say, okay, there's ideological capture, and that's true
Hmm.
in most of the major institutions. How can it be that medical journals are,
Hmm.
using these vulgar languages to refer to women?
Right.
How can it be that the public health organizations are doing scientism, not science? How can it be that um, psychotherapy training has turned into political activism? Maybe social workers were
Hmm.
always a little bit more political active, but now
Hmm.
everywhere and
Hmm.
without question. So it's easy to feel horrible when you're in it, like you're in a cult,
Hmm.
and it feel very cynical when you're out of it. And people have a hard time believing how bad it is.
Hmm.
So that's a major problem. Um, and I don't want people to feel cynical.
Hmm.
So I want to tell a young person, be careful, or I think there are problems there, or the system is corrupt. But you can't tell them to do nothing. Don't grow
Hmm.
up, don't join
Right.
anything.
No.
Or you can, but I don't think it's helpful to them. So
Hmm.
how would I bind?
Hmm.
The best way I can work with this, I don't know. It depends on what we're talking about. We touch different sides of this
Hmm.
structure.
Hmm.
We, we talk about it slightly differently. But the best thing I can do is to say, this is a problem. It's like taking the meta step back and saying, things are crazy now. You're young, you don't know how it used to be even a short time ago, but it's not always like this. And I doubt it will be like this in a short time again. We're in a kind of fever. And you have to get good at using your own mind. And don't let everybody else tell you what words mean or how you're supposed to think. Something like that. So that even if you join on with things and you're feeling pressures, notice it. And boy, you'd better cultivate that feeling because they're going to try to stamp it out of you. I don't know. There's that great meme I saw last week. There's always another good one that said something like, yes, I'm in a cult. We indoctrinate people to think for themselves.
Hmm.
So That's the spirit.
Yeah.
Yes, we're trying to make something happen in another person, but it isn't where I get more control.
Mhm. No, I think
And
that's really well said. I think that's a really, I like that a lot. Um,
yeah,
it is the world that we're in. And you have to decide how we're going to engage with it.
yeah. The other thing I try to do when people were like, we're having this, we're
Mhm.
trying to have this, God, we're trying to make sense of this, right? All the time you're spending, we're trying, and I feel like most people are just trying to do their life. They're not that interested in having this conversation, but more and more people are because they get a sense that something's wrong. And so for anyone who's trying to make sense of it and figure out what's right or how we fix this, um, it seems to me that this issue of structure is vital. So I try to say that, if we're talking about any one idea, we're in one place in the structure, but you can lose the orientation. So I like to have a hierarchical, notice hierarchical, I say, because that's one of the moral foundations is that we have a hierarchical structure for understanding this. And so, for instance, in psychotherapy, right, I want to say that there are certain base level foundational things that are hills I will die on. And one of them is free speech, right? Free association, right, is one of the earliest psychotherapeutic principles and techniques that encourages free speech, even if what you say, especially if what you're going to say is dark and dirty, you need to have it out so we can work with it. Right? We need to allow other people their free speech. That means even if we disagree with them, where it's not truly free. Right? Just for instance, right? There's a few other principles like maybe a second one is dedication to the individual person, not them as member of a group, not political activism, not my needs. Okay, there's two. I don't know how many more I could come up with quickly, but that's a foundational, whoa, this is super core. This is the cornerstone of the building. But structurally, we could have another conversation about things like theoretical orientation or what we think is the best way to deal with homelessness or uh, what one or another population needs in mental health. What's the best school to go to? Fine, let's talk about it. But it's at a higher level of inference where I have less confidence. I might disagree with somebody, let them think differently. I'm not going to die on that hill. I like this school or this theoretical orientation. You like a different one. I think we can coexist. I might even have strong opinions, but okay. You know what I mean? And so this is a higher level of inference, higher level of structure. And then maybe a third level is these really subtle, complicated things like culture.
Mhm.
So immigrant family with a totally different family structure wants their child to act the way the parents say they should act. But in American culture, we more, celebrate the adolescent rebellion and the child is doing that. And now, uh-oh, I'm the clinician. Where do I come down on this issue? How do I respond helpfully to parent, child, family, mental health for somebody who is from two places at once? And the subtleties they would get really important. All of the issues of culture and mental health that are true diversity, I say, really gray area stuff. Again, we can have strong opinions, and there is right and wrong there, I believe, but man, it's a higher level of inference, and there's going to be a lot more disagreement.
Mm.
Um, is this making any sense? This is just a way of saying I think there's a structure. And so when we get into a conversation or a heated debate about it, if we're better at recognizing where in that structure we are, then we'll have a much better conversation. And for instance, if we disagree at level 3, fine, let's have a beer.
Mhm.
But if we're disagreeing at level 1, ooh, does the
Yeah.
friendship, you know?
Mhm.
And if one person's at a different level, they think the levels are reversed. Now we can talk about the structure. Does it make sense that you could talk about culture at a sophisticated level if you can't speak freely? And I'm
Mhm.
going to say no.
Mhm.
Another person could argue differently, but at least now we have a coherent way to understand our difference. So to me, it's like a hierarchical version of the moral foundations theory, which is broad. And I'm eager to develop this structure and to think about the conversation we're having, not just the things we're saying, if that makes any sense.
It does make a lot of sense. I mean, you're talking about a process, not just the content.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what you do with Your Positive Sum. That's what the program is. It's
That's,
a conflict management or conflict processing or what?
yeah, something
Yeah.
like that. But I
Okay.
call, again, it's not written down enough yet.
Yeah.
We're coming soon, right? I actually should have a landing page for it any day, but, and I'll prepare it. It'll be up there soon. But the idea is the positive, you know, this game theory idea of positive sum, I suppose, the idea that we could interact in a way where we both benefit,
Hmm.
right? And a zero sum is where if you win, I lose. Okay, so I think that in the culture war arena, and in mental health and in all kind of ways, we ought to be developing as much as possible a positive sum approach to life and to each other, right? I call it the playground of ideas, building off Winnicott's idea of play and of that being a good therapy and fun and even funny with humor and just more lively and free-spirited. This is what we should be doing as much as possible.
Hmm.
But there does exist a zero sum, what I call the battleground of identities, where people fight stuff out. And I don't think I'm not such a pacifist. I like peace, but I'm not such a pacifist that I think we should never fight. And I don't mean physically fight. I mean vociferously battle over an idea, not attack a person, but strongly, strenuously attack a bad idea. So that's the zero sum side of things.
Hmm.
Uh, and I'm saying something like free speech is where I'll die. That's a battle. If you're going to tell me that I and other people can't speak, you're having a fight with me. You're telling me that I don't have freedom and I really value freedom. You know what I mean? And so, but can we, on the positive sum side, can we actually debate, wait, what are the limits of that freedom? And if I say something that hurts you, should I care about that? Should I say it differently? Maybe. That would be really interesting and nuanced, but it would be different than saying I can't say it. Anyway, so this is an effort to try to draw these lines in a structural way, with the metaphor being play. Yeah. So I have a story or two that could illustrate that if you want, but that's the short version of what I think is an important distinction to be drawn.
I think this is really useful. And I think people, from what I've been seeing and hearing about from people, there's just so much division over things that are happening sort of conceptually and far away.
Yes.
And you hear people losing friends and family relationships over a disagreement about politics or about what,
Right.
what they think of trans kids or something like that.
Hmm.
And that seems like it is for for a lot of people, it's very concrete and it's happening to them. It's in their immediate sphere. But for many people, it's really not. It's kind of like we're describing the sorts of things we're hearing about or reading about on social media or reading about in the news and allowing those to kind of take that place of where you're putting the free speech sort of level one. So
Yeah.
those come down and become level one, and now they're non-negotiable and we have an out. So yeah,
Right. It gets moralized
yeah.
to such a degree that if people, what the term, right, one of the terms is social justice warrior, right? If
Mhm.
everything is a war, is a battle, then we don't have a positive sum arena anymore to play with the ideas. And one way that happens is if things seem remote. Yeah, it's easy to send a missile over to another continent and kill a bunch of people you never have met and don't know, and they just seem like evil people. But if you actually know someone, it might even be hard to say something mean to them, let alone kill them, right? And so you would then be more likely to say, God, you're wrong, or I disagree with you, or I even hate you in this moment, but you're in a conversation with a human being.
Mhm.
Right. So that sense of remoteness you bring up is very important.
Yeah, it's the difference between arguing with someone face to face and typing at them on social media behind an
Right.
avatar.
one of the fuelers of this problem
Yeah.
is the anonymity, right? And distance, as you point out.
Mhm.
Yeah, in fact, it's one of the things you get, right? I mean, I like to not only talk about the problem and be theoretical about its structure, but also come up with something very, very practical, as I promised I would do, right? Earlier. So here's one example, right? It's not new by me, but there's this idea that if you're going to bridge these culture war issues, you befriend people. You befriend people who are different, or you value already a friendship you have, even when you find out that the person is different.
Mhm.
Because it's much harder to vilify somebody who you know their family, or you know what they've been through, or you've seen them do good things.
Mhm.
And you know, you kind of know them and you feel, okay, they, you know, certain things I dislike about them, but overall, this is a human being. And then you think, how could they think that? You know? But now you have to work on that rather than just think, oh, I know why they think it. It's
Mhm.
because they're evil or stupid. Right? It's much harder to do that with somebody you already know. So yeah, that's one of the techniques
Mhm.
of drawing things back from the battleground into the playground and say, well, maybe we should talk about this. Maybe I should think about it. Maybe I've been doing something wrong in my thinking. Is that even possible? You know, yes. And so, right, that's nice how you do that. Bring it close to home with people you know.
Oh, I love that. I really like that a lot. It's very practical and it's good advice.
Mhm. One of the stories, just stop me if you want to go into something else, but one of the stories I use for understanding this is, again, I like doing levels. I like really thinking about levels of analysis. So when we talk about what I like is the metaphor of play and of the playground. Um, you know, one of the ways, start with this. A way of understanding a zero sum is using sports metaphor. So if my soccer team scores a goal, that's good for me, bad for your team, right? There's no way for both teams to benefit
Hmm.
from goal scoring.
Hmm.
So it's zero sum. But, and this I think happens a lot in psychotherapy if you're doing it right, is that if you step back a moment and you think, wait, but the game is fun. The game is a positive sum experience for most people if it's done right. So within the soccer field, we're having a game. It's a sport, and in sports, everybody can benefit. You learn by losing. You're a good sport. In doing so, maybe you had fun even though you lost. You'll get them next time. You were the best on your team, or the coach teaches you something from the loss. Who knows? There's all kind of ways to benefit from the sport of soccer, even when you lose the game.
Hmm.
And so when you do this, now we're talking about a playfulness in the idea and in the idea of the encounter. And the way this really, it just one day, it struck me because my daughter scored for the first time in this game I was watching. But I did this bad father thing, as I wasn't videoing the event at that moment. You know how often people are saying they're videoing the whole game, you know, and they have just
You missed
hours
that one moment.
or the video, but I missed her first goal. And so I was just like, you know, I'm looking around, is anybody else doing it? No.
Mm.
And without thinking, it took no planning, it took no sophistication. I walked over to the other side where the opposing team had this enormous tripod that were videoing the whole thing for their purposes of coaching or whatever. I just walked right up and I said, does anybody get that last goal? Maybe you could send me the video. And I completely knew what would happen, which is they were all, you know, charmed and have, oh, it was their first goal, whatever. And everybody was happy to help me
Mhm.
out. This is parents on the other team, right? Where sometimes fights happen on the sideline, right? I mean, people can really get activated and we're enemies. This is zero sum. Nuh-uh. Not when you're thinking of it, not just as a sport, but now at a higher level of analysis. These are parents supporting children and everybody's in on the game. Everybody knows at a visceral level what it means to catch that video. And they're all in on helping me as a fellow parent.
Mm.
You know, and I knew this in an instant. To me, this is cultural knowledge. And it's what happens is that it's something you know, even though you could never explain it if asked. And this is the kind of thing that happens, I think, in mental health and in psychotherapy all the time. Is there's something going on, and it can be going on for years without being noticed by client or therapist. And it's this effort to do this kind of reflective process where you notice an unspoken rule or feeling that is really important. And it's been overlooked. Anyway, so that is like, this is what an anthropologist does, right? You study the eating practices of the whoever, and you think you're studying, their nutritional intake, but after a year living with them, you figure out that the way they eat means something else about their family structure and about what they take to be God, and that kind of thing. And that's what you write your big paper on. So this is a similar kind of stepping back process that I think is so applicable to depth psychotherapy. And that's just my little story of how it was fascinated me that I knew this was going to work out with these parents on the other side of the soccer field. I just knew it, of course. It's not even that, intelligent. It's just what's different is that I realized, oh, that's a window. That's a window into this cultural space that we're always talking about as skin tone. And to me, I don't know if it works for you, but to me, it's an example of how much richer and commonplace and everywhere, every day, cultural differences occur. And we can do this game of and analyzing it as a game, but there's 100 games going on at all times. And so which is zero sum? I don't know. Plenty of them are positive sum if you reach for it.
That's really creative and optimistic, and I love it. Can you apply that thinking to another one of our culture war issues? Do you see how that applies to some of the big things we fight about, maybe like presidential politics or something?
Sure, let's think about that. Right, well, on a simple level, we could just go to process, right? So the wrong guy got voted in, whatever. But at the process level, is it an expression of the popular will? And so this is where I think this stuff comes up about like voting integrity. And people, by the way, not just Trump, right? Famously in 2020 says, well, I don't think the results were valid, but it's, you know this, I'm sure most people I think now are aware, if they're following this stuff, that there has been a lot of people on both sides of the aisle questioning the election integrity since at least 2000 when there was the big Florida debacle.
Yeah.
Before then, right? But certainly since then, there's been a lot. And so here's a process issue that it seems to me has enormous possibility to be positive sum, which is that I don't know who won, let's say you and I disagree about who should win, but we could agree on the idea that there should be a robust integrity of the vote. And how we're going to get there, we're going to debate, and we might even be unfair in our strategy about what we think needs to change so that our side gets the better angle on it. But we could agree on the process, hopefully. That would be an example of taking one step. Yeah, again, back to, free speech. Should there be censorship of the public sphere where political matters are at play? I want to say can't be. The institutions can't be thrown on the scale, or they're not trustworthy anymore. So you could say, oh, the institution has to intervene now because we need the right result, or we need people to believe the right thing, whatever that means. And you can always have that temptation. And I want to say, nope, we have to preserve the process and the integrity of the system where we can actually trust the so-called experts or the institutions or the information sphere. So to me, that's just, does that answer your question? I think so. It's a higher level of analysis of a system or a process that at our best, we should be able to agree on.
Yeah, that does answer my question. I like that analysis. Are you in general optimistic about where we are going, where things are going?
It's funny you said that. I don't know if you saw my facial expression when you said that a minute ago. I was thinking, yeah, it's a moment of revealing, I think, of me. So
Mhm.
I'm not at issue here, but just momentarily to say, yes, I think I'm optimistic to a fault.
Okay.
So you have to hear me being optimistic with a grain of salt. But but yeah, I suppose it's obvious and transparent in a way with my model that I'm trying to develop optimism. I'm taking the idea that there is positive sum, that it doesn't have to all be a battle to the death.
Mhm.
So am I optimistic? You're asking? You mean now about what? Everything, like the big picture, the
The culture war, if you will,
culture war,
or
yeah.
the things not making sense. The what you said earlier about kind of this idea that saner heads would prevail at some point.
Hmm. Yes. Yes, I mean, I am optimistic. Um, I think it is happening. I think that somehow, I promise you, I think you know this from our earlier conversations, that I was preparing for years actually to come out and talk like this before maybe it got a little safer in the sense that there are more people breaking through this bubble of silence. But I think it's easier now.
Mhm.
I think there's the Overton window has
Yeah.
been opened. And so I think that's a good sign. The better sign I think that's very important is I see that, I'm developing this model of positive sum, or what I call cultural psychology, is how I was taught to think about the interface between culture and psychology and all that. But others are doing similar things. People are trying, and I think with success, understanding the structure of all this, right? The ideas, not not just having shouting matches, but there are people who are developing on the kind of anti-woke side, um, ideas which counter wokeism, but also go farther, go forward, and construct something. Don't just oppose. I see that happening, and that gives me a lot of hope. Um, I suppose the other side of that, does exist. I'm afraid. One thing I think of is that we have a lot of problems, right, in this world,
Mhm.
right? How are we going to tackle things like um, weapons that could be very destructive and cheap and available everywhere. And so who knows what people are going to kind of violence people are going to do to others, even if they're remote, as you say, and
Mhm.
therefore easy to vilify and easy to justify killing them. We've got AI taking over. We don't even know what people should do for a living or what to study. If there'll be room for humans, or if we'll all be lazing around and getting our uh, UBI, so many things are changing so quickly. I find that very um, destabilizing. And so it's cause for great concern. And if we're still fighting over this dumb stuff, this stuff that seems, you word used the word earlier, absurd.
Mhm.
I think these are absurdities. And if we humans are so incapable of getting beyond absurdities to solve real problems, wow, that's scary.
Yeah.
So in a nutshell, that both exist. I am afraid, but I think we're moving in the right direction now,
Mhm.
unlike how I felt for decades.
Mhm. I think you're right. It is getting easier. I've seen a change in the past few years in what people can talk about.
Hmm.
I think that's a good marker.
Okay. So as a process issue, we could say you see an opening of that too. Now the question would be on the content. What, when we speak, are we developing? What are we saying? Does it just mean more people are shouting and in the other direction?
Mm.
Or are we actually building something?
That's a good question. I think a little bit of both. I
Uh-huh.
think that there's a building happening though. I think that there's a something that I've been grateful for, even though there's so much that's really frustrating and concerning about this sort of, oh gosh, I could give it labels, but we'll just be vague. The sort of ideological things that are happening.
Mhm.
Um, I am really grateful for the opportunity to have so many deep and almost existential philosophical discussions about the nature of things, the nature of
Mhm.
our perceived reality in our culture. So um, just the fact that I can sit around and do that, I feel
Yeah.
like that's a pretty good thing. And I hear other people doing a lot of that as well.
And you so deserve it, Leslie. You were an early mover in this, and you took grief for
Mhm.
what you did. You spoke about that earlier, and I know it's true for you and many others. And I feel really bad for the people who are stuck in these positions.
Yeah, I lost my graduate degree. I was almost done and I got ousted from my school.
Exactly.
Yeah, and with all the debt still in the bag. So yeah, it was
It's a lot
terrible.
of time. It's a lot of
It was a
yeah,
huge investment.
yeah. And made to feel, or I don't know, people trying to make you feel at least like a horrible person for doing something courageous and dignified and holding on to your conscience. I mean, this should be celebrated, not attacked. And no, you took a lot of, and so you benefit now in another way because
Mm.
you've made a career of this. I mean, found a guy to marry, all the things that would, which are out there. But this concerns me actually. This is another way that I feel not optimistic yet. Hopeful, maybe, but not optimistic, is that you have done that. And good for you, right? So happy about it to see it. Well, I don't know the answer, and I'd like to know yours. What percentage of people do you think can? If you become famous, you have an influence on YouTube, or you um, write a book, or you're independently wealthy, or there's all kind of ways that you can make a new career out of doing this or succeed. But I think one of the things we really have to build next in this is for the normal guy
Mhm.
or gal, right? That anybody who doesn't have a lot of sway, but wants to take a chance and say something truthful, or even more importantly, say something wrong, and not then be skewered, but be out there exploring, trying to figure it out with other human beings, right? This has to be okay again. And I don't think it is now. So I'm afraid that we see some of the people like you who gain prominence by taking on this monster. And I don't know how many people are getting crushed along the way, but we never see them.
Mhm.
I'd like to know that. And I really think that should be one of our next steps, is
Mhm.
that we have to be strongly supporting that kind of person.
Yeah, I think that is a good point. I have been able to manage an ongoing recording project with people talking about these things, which has
Mm.
been beneficial in some ways and made me vulnerable in other ways. There's very little money in this kind of thing. Like this recording project, it's not its own reward financially. It's very, very scant. I think I got $145 from the whole project. That's YouTube, Spotify, everything. That's kind of a monthly, maybe 100 to $150. And when you think about all the hours you spend recording, you're not getting compensated for your time. But what I do get compensated, the way that I get compensated is by forming relationships with people that are that I'm speaking with and the people that are listening. So there's a relationship being built there. I had a coaching practice when I was in graduate school. I was already working as a coach, and people have found me through these conversations. And so that helps me to sustain something that's actually really hard for people to build, which is an independent private practice. That's really hard, whether you're a coach or a counselor or whatever you are. That is a huge number of those folks really struggle in doing that to
Mhm.
and I haven't struggled as much as I would if I didn't have kind of a platform and a voice. So you're right. There are definite like benefits to that. And I wonder what that's like for other people. I do wonder what that's like because if I were having to figure out advertising and marketing and all of that, that would be a different story. And I have talked with people who left graduate programs in a similar kind of way to
Yeah.
myself, and I'm thinking of one person in particular, really fantastic woman who would have been a remarkable counselor, and she had a similar situation to my own
Yes.
and left and is still kind of struggling to make sense of it all. and isn't left with the ability to manage like a coaching practice or anything like that. She's just starting from scratch with let's go back to the drawing board. And that's really hard. So I think you're pointing to something that's really real and important.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm afraid it's real and important for a lot of people.
Mhm.
And I hate it if I diminished, what you've gone
No,
through
no, not at all. Not at
a
all.
certain prominence, but that doesn't necessarily solve all your real world problems either, does it?
Yeah. No,
Um,
it is a trade-off. I am really happy that I made the decision that I made, though. One thing I'm not necessarily always happy with is um how much self-revealing I don't sit easily with that. Like there's this conversation, you're having these public conversations, and it's just like you're being vulnerable enough to do that now too. I mean, you're talking about your thoughts and putting your process out there. And I've spent so many hours doing that that I kind of feel a little bit like sometimes I feel like I just want to take it all down and go and be private again. So there's
right.
that, but overall the process has been really rewarding for me. And if I've learned one thing as I've gone through this that can help people who are stuck in that. I loved
Yeah.
how you described it. I want to think about that some more, and I want to hear maybe you or more people talk about this more, this idea of the internal, that confusion being a useful bit of information about the other. I've never really thought about that countertransference sort
Oh,
of aspect of all of this. That's so interesting to me.
yeah.
But people who are dealing with that in that moment, all of that conflict is inside the person
Yes.
rather than being out. And if you can find a way to externalize that and make sense of it and talk about it and share about it, you are relieving yourself of a great internal burden that is incredibly destabilizing and confusing. And so
Yes.
I would say that my process of doing that moved me from being in a really, really difficult emotional and psychological place
Mhm.
to being much more robust and confident and capable in my own
Right.
processing of that. So it
Mhm.
even though there are other things that came with that, I'm in a better place than I think I would be if I hadn't taken the steps that I did take.
That's so important. And to be able to look back and see how that works for yourself. And that is something which I do think helps other people to hear.
Mhm.
Despite a lot of pain that came with it, and maybe some ongoing sense of being overexposed and ambivalence about the whole thing,
Mhm.
you could still be glad you did it. And why? Because, well, a lot of reasons, but one of them is that it helped you do that untangling that you were talking about in the meme, the therapist meme, but you've now
Yes.
done it partly for yourself.
Yeah.
And it was because um, you had to go to the other side, even though
Mhm.
you didn't know what was going to be there. Yeah, that countertransference is very important. I think, we could talk about that more. Um, I imagine we don't have time now to do it, but you tell me but yeah, this idea of right, how to deal with that. And because countertransference is often talked about as a feeling,
Mhm.
but sometimes it's a process.
Mhm.
And so this idea that you could be having an experience that is a process, not just a feeling, and that would be something which you absorbed from another person or from the environment is itself really interesting. And that's why I think you hear people say this so often. They say, I feel crazy.
Mhm.
People use this word not just about themselves. They say things are crazy, right? And it's less now. Well, I don't know if it's less now, but it's very much a commonly used word. And people also will say things like when they encounter another person, they kind of in whispers come to you, because I haven't been very out, and I have very strong feelings, mixed feelings about, as you know, talking about these thoughts I have, not just for self-protection, there's that, but as a therapist, I tend very carefully not to self-disclose. And here I'm not a therapist, but nonetheless, I think there's value in not. I don't know quite how to describe it now. The point is that I think an exception to when self-disclosure can be helpful and useful is like this, where you feel so tangled up inside,
Mhm.
you think you must be crazy. you have to that it's very helpful to figure out, oh wait, I'm not crazy. I just disagree. Or I'm not completely alone. There are at least some people who agree with me about this, but I've been made to feel as if I'm completely isolated and I must be the only person around here who thinks that 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's bad. And you need to be able to get that out, as you say, and work on digest it, we would say. And so that's what therapy can often help people do. And it seems to me that a time to take the risk, for me anyway, a time to take the risk of speaking out has been when not just that I disagree or have bad feelings or others do, but things are absurd. The word you used earlier. They feel crazy. They don't make sense. It's beyond bad. It's beyond disagree. It's beyond hurt feelings. There's something nuts going on. And when that happens, I think that the only proper thing to do is to say, are you seeing what I'm seeing? You know, that kind of attitude that Alice Drager talks about in her fantastic book, Galileo's Middle Finger. You know, she says to look up at the sky and say, do you see what I see? Or to have this kind of social experience of trying to get oriented to the stars or to the existential. You said existential. What is real? If you're losing track of what's real, even in your own head, you can't ignore that. You gotta find a way to reach out to other people. So that would be my advocacy for, or anyway, what for myself meant that I had to do this. I couldn't just carry on in silence, or I would have felt that I hadn't done the right thing for the next generation, or even for myself, that it's too oppressive. It breaks your brain. So yeah, something like that.
Yeah, very well put. Thank you. I want to respect your time, so perhaps we should draw to a close, but do you feel like we missed anything that was important to be said, or is there anything that is left for this conversation that should be a nice way to sum it up or
Oh wow.
draw
I
from
don't
it?
know about summing it up at this moment. Let me try to think. I mean, I certainly feel that there's so many more avenues to go down in this. You know, it is like this mole run structure. I think there's many topics we could address, but I don't feel untied about it.
Okay.
Do you? I mean, are there things that we left that we need to return to?
I feel like there's so many threads to tug on, and I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and I feel like I could just continue to ask you little questions about this all day long. So, uh, but no, I think that it's, I appreciate the way that you've looked at these things and the way that you've described, and there's this sort of you said that you were optimistic to a fault, but I appreciate that there's a reframe that you're offering.
Uh-huh.
That's something that individuals have to just purposely choose to accept or not. It kind of goes back to those inner resources. It's just a callback to the individual to choose how they're going to interact with these situations and with
Uh-huh.
these opportunities, really. I mean, you can look at all of the conflict in our lives as opportunities if you want to. I like the positive sum.
Oh, good. Yeah. Yeah, we could talk more about that someday or any number of these things. It's nice your callback, yeah, to the inner resources. Maybe another callback is to this idea of, oh, now if I lost it, because a reframe, yeah, is good, but you can't lose the pain either.
Mhm.
Sometimes a reframe is used to just compartmentalize
Mhm.
suffering, positive mental attitude, which I love that. Great. But careful, right? Because there's something that you don't want to lose in
Mhm.
hurt you. So maybe, yeah, this idea of being optimistic is the callback that it's important to be optimistic and to go to the inner resources and try to move forward in a constructive manner
Mhm.
without losing the nuance and the subtlety of the fact that you are hurting or that you
Mhm.
disagree with somebody
Mhm.
or that you're afraid. Hmm. Yeah, so I don't know if that adds much right now, but no,
Mhm.
I can stop. This is great. I really enjoy
My
honestly.
favorite reframe that you offered was the soccer example.
Oh yeah.
How you could have looked at that as in group, out group, us versus them. And then you stepped back a little bit and just reconceptualized, like, no, we all really are here together. We are all
Yeah.
really at an underlying values-based level. We're here. We're all on the same team, really. We're parents.
Right.
Yeah, I like
Right.
that.
Couldn't there be more opportunities to do that in other aspects, like you
Mhm.
asked? Yeah. Couldn't we say, oh, we're on that same team, or actually,
Mhm.
you know,
Maybe
it feels
so.
feels like we're enemies, but not nearly as often as it appears.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, do you want to give people a place they can find you? Do you have writing online or a link or anything you want to offer up?
This promised website, which is something, but I think it will any day, at least as a landing
Okay.
place, is yourpositivesum.com.
Okay.
I reserve that domain, so it's yourpositivesum, SUM, right? .com, and there will be an opportunity to be updated when the real thing goes live. I'm going to have a Substack going. Um, I'm on X, Twitter, but I have tweeted zero things. You know, I'm just kind of ready to do that at some point. I have a lot to do, but no, I don't have a lot of content or anything yet. But I'm in that direction. So if somebody would like to be in touch, they could go to the website, give an email, and I'll be active soon. If that
Okay.
helps.
Fantastic. I'll put the link in the description.
Hmm.
And thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. It's been a delight to speak with you, and I've learned a lot, and I look forward to connecting with you in the future.
Hope so. Good, Leslie. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Doug.